Welcome to a new deep dive. Today we're looking into something really quite extraordinary. It starts with what looks like a totally normal transaction, buying a piece of land.
Yeah, just the standard property deal, you might think.
Exactly. But according to the sources we've looked at, this one deal, this single contract for a former military site, is claimed to have, well, basically changed the entire global order. Forever.
It sounds incredible, doesn't it? How could that even be possible? A property purchase shaking the foundations of international relations.
That's the million-dollar question, and it's what we're diving into today. We're going deep into something called the Staten Successionsurkunde, Form 4098, State Succession Deed, Form 4098.
We need to figure out what this thing actually is, according to the sources. Where did it come from? And crucially, what are these huge consequences people are attributing to it based on the materials you gave us?
Right. Now, I've got a pretty diverse pile of material here. Legal-sounding explanations, writings presented as the buyer's own memoirs, and even, well, glimpses into a pretty radical vision for the future.
It's quite a mix. So our job today, really, is to pull out the main ideas, the key claims from all these sources.
Yeah, figure out how they supposedly link together and what it all might mean, again, strictly according to the information we've been provided with.
And just to be clear for you listening, we're presenting what's in these sources. That's our role here. We sort through it, try to make sense of the arguments presented, and lay it out for you.
Exactly. We're not endorsing it. We're not debunking it based on outside info. We're just exploring the content of the documents themselves. It's purely an analysis of the source material provided.
Okay, let's get into it. The Staten Successionsurkunde 140098. The sources describe it as a real, existing international treaty.
So the foundation is this actual treaty, apparently signed October 6, 1998. And it started off looking like, well, the purchase of a NATO military property, the Turin Barracks in Zweibrücken, Germany.
That's right. And the buyer was just a private individual, a natural person, referred to in all the sources simply as the buyer.
But, and this is the kicker, the sources claim this was just a cover, a disguise.
Precisely. They argue that in reality, this deed wasn't just about property. It was an international treaty of, and I'm quoting here, enormous historical significance.
Okay, enormous significance how? What's the core claim?
The claim is it didn't just transfer the land and buildings, it supposedly transferred the sovereign rights of all UN and NATO member states, plus their physical networks, their legal networks, everything apparently, to this one buyer.
Wow, okay, that's a huge leap. How do the sources justify connecting this specific property to all UN and NATO states?
Well, they put a lot of emphasis on the nature of the property itself. The Turin Barracks, it's described as a military network hub for the U.S. forces.
A network hub, meaning communications, data.
Yeah, things like that. It apparently had internationally connected systems, mobitic is mentioned. So the idea presented is that its telecommunications infrastructure was inherently international right from the start.
Okay, so the property itself had international links. What about the surrounding area, this Kreuzberg area?
Right, that area was a former U.S. base. Parts of it were actually handed over to Germany back in '93.
So civilian stuff started moving in. Universities, businesses.
Exactly. And these new civilian areas got connected to the public German networks, power, water, internet, etc. But crucially, some were apparently still integrated with the old barracks network infrastructure.
Ah, so you had an overlap. Old military networks and new public networks kind of tangled together.
That seems to be the picture painted. Electricity, telecom, sewage, heating, sometimes using the old systems, sometimes the new, sometimes both. Internal and external connections, maybe some redundancy.
And this overlap, this connection, is important in the argument.
According to the sources, it's absolutely critical. They point to specific wording in the contract text. Section 3, paragraph 1st of the deed.
What does it say?
It says the purchase included the property with all rights and obligations as well as components, in particular the internal and external development, Erschließung.
Internal and external development.
Yeah.
It sounds like standard property legalese, maybe covering pipes and cables on the land.
On the surface, yes. But the sources argue this specific phrase was the trigger, the key. They claim it was deliberately phrased that way within what looked like a normal German property contract, precisely to mask its true international legal purpose.
So the claim is intentional camouflage, hiding an international treaty inside a domestic property sale.
That's the core assertion. Disguise was supposedly part of the plan. And they also point to Section 21, a severability clause, as being important.
A severability clause?
Yeah.
What does that usually do?
Typically, it means if one part of a contract is found to be invalid, the rest of the contract still stands.
And how is it interpreted here in these sources?
They claim it means if any part is invalid under, say, German law, then the relevant international law kicks in instead. This is supposed to ensure the treaty survives, even if, for example, one of the original potential buyers mentioned in the documents couldn't legally be part of an international treaty.
So if one buyer drops out, the other one, the buyer we're talking about, gets everything.
That's the legal argument presented in the sources, yes. It
Huh.
keeps the transfer intact with the remaining eligible party.
Okay, so we have the contract, the alleged hidden meaning, the critical wording about development, and the severability clause. That's the setup.
Right.
But how do we get from one barracks in Germany, however networked, to transferring the sovereignty of all UN and NATO nations? That still feels like a massive jump. This is where the domino effect comes in, right?
Exactly. The domino effect is, well, it's the engine driving the whole global claim in these sources. It's how they explain the alleged worldwide reach.
So how does this domino chain reaction supposedly work?
The sources stress that the entire Erschließung, all the networks, telecom cables, power lines, gas pipes, water, sewage, heating, everything on that Kreuzberg site formed a single unified entity.
Not just the land, but the whole infrastructure package was sold as one thing.
That's the claim. And now comes the big step. They argue that selling the telecommunications part of that infrastructure, which belonged to a NATO facility managed by Germany, meant transferring control over the entire German telecom network.
The whole national network, because of this one connection point.
That's the argument presented, and the same logic, they claim, applies to the power grid, the gas network, and so on. Sovereignty over all these national networks allegedly passed to the buyer.
Is there any legal basis cited for that specific claim about network sovereignty?
They sometimes point to Article 87 of the German Basic Law, which deals with federal administration of post and telecommunications. The interpretation seems to be that control over the physical network equals sovereignty over the service.
Okay, that's quite an interpretation. And how does it go global from there?
This is the cascade part. According to the sources, the moment any part of this network connects to another public network, or when different types of networks cross paths.
Like a phone line crossing a power line underground.
Well, more like the connection points between systems. When a connection happens, or networks overlap, the sources use the phrase from network to network and land to land. The legal unit supposedly expands. And with it, the buyers claimed sovereignty.
So physical connection equals legal expansion of territory in this view.
That's exactly the argument. Every time a gas network is linked to an electricity grid or a phone network connects to the internet backbone, it's seen as widening the buyer's sphere of control.
And this applies across borders.
Yes, they claim it affects all physically connected networks, right down to the cables coming into your house. In all NATO countries and potentially beyond, because telecommunications and broadband networks are global.
So using the internet in the U.S., for example, would fall under this, according to the sources.
They claim it binds all countries that somehow agreed to the treaty, which seems to be interpreted very broadly. The networks stretch globally, Europe, the U.S., and consumers. Everyone connected is supposedly bound.
What about networks built after 1998? New fiber optic lines, 5G infrastructure.
The sources suggest they fall under it too. If they're connected to or become part of this expanding Erschließung unit, the argument is that the sovereign rights transferred in '98 automatically cover these future extensions.
Wow. So it's a constantly growing domain based on physical infrastructure expansion.
That's the concept. It's a really radical idea, equating physical connectivity with expanding legal sovereignty on a global scale.
It certainly is. But hang on. If only Germany and the buyer signed this deed, how do these sources claim that international organizations like the UN and NATO and all these other countries are legally bound by it? They weren't signatories.
Ah, good question. This is where the sources bring in the concept of the treaty chain.
A treaty chain, what's that?
The argument is that the Staatensuccessionsurkunde 1098 doesn't just stand alone. It supposedly plugs into existing, already ratified international agreements and relationships.
Like what? Could you give examples from the sources?
Sure. Section 2 of the deed itself apparently refers to the legal relationship concerning the transfer from the Dutch forces. Section 2, paragraph V, number 1, mentions something called the TKS Telepost Treaty.
Okay.
And beyond those specific references, the sources claim the deed connects to broader frameworks, the NATO Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, the main NATO treaty, host nation support agreements, and, significantly, the regulations of the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, which operates under the UN.
Okay, so these existing treaties are called the mother treaties.
That's the term used in the sources, yes. And the Staaten Succession Circund 1498 is presented as being effectively a material addendum to all these mother treaties.
A material addendum. What does that mean in practical terms, according to this argument? Does it mean it changes the original treaties?
Essentially, yes. The claim is it modifies the substance of these existing agreements. And crucially, the sources argue that because it's just an addendum modifying existing ratified treaties, no new ratification was needed from all the individual member states of NATO or the UNITO.
Wait, so the argument is that Germany, by signing this deed with the buyer, could unilaterally modify treaties that bind dozens of other countries without those countries explicitly agreeing to this specific change.
That's the interpretation presented. The original ratification of the mother treaties is claimed to automatically extend its binding power to cover this addendum. Germany was supposedly competent to make this change with effect for the whole system.
That sounds legally unconventional, to say the least.
It's definitely a unique interpretation of treaty law presented in these documents.
Okay, so let's follow this logic. How does the ITU connection work to bind UN members?
Right. The ITU regulates global telecommunications. It's a UN specialized agency.
So almost every country is an ITU member.
Exactly. And since the deed 1298 is claimed to be an addendum to the ITU regulations,
Then any country using the global telecom networks regulated by the ITU is, according to this logic, submitting to the deed and the buyer's supposed sovereignty.
that is precisely the claim made in the sources. Simply using the phone or internet, which relies on IPU standards, is interpreted as implicitly accepting this transformed legal order and the buyer's authority over it. That's how they argue it ropes in basically all UN members.
Just using the network implies consent to this specific treaty.
That's the core of the argument presented regarding the ITU link. It's quite something.
And NATO. How are NATO members bound, besides the general ITU argument?
Well, two ways, according to the sources. First, as heavy users of global ITU-regulated communications, they're caught that way. But second, the deed is also claimed to be a material addendum specifically to all NATO treaties.
Okay, so if it's an addendum to NATO treaties, what does that supposedly do to NATO itself?
According to the sources, it has profound effects. It allegedly changes the very meaning of key NATO articles.
Like Article 5, collective defense.
Yes, Articles 3, 4, 5, 6. They're all claimed to now have a global interpretation, not just limited to the North Atlantic area.
Yeah.
And the NATO Status of Forces Agreement, the SOFA, which governs troops stationed abroad, it supposedly stops being an agreement between sovereign nations. Instead, it becomes just an internal administrative rulebook for the buyer, managing forces within his now global territory.
So stationing U.S. troops in Germany, for example, wouldn't be based on German consent anymore, but on the buyer's internal rules.
That's the implication drawn in the sources, and they take it even further.
How so?
They argue that since NATO is bound to the buyer, and NATO is considered the most powerful regional arrangement under the UN Charter,
Chapter 8 of the Charter, yeah.
then any continued cooperation between NATO and the UN implies that the UN, and by extension its members, are de facto recognizing this new legal reality. They're implicitly accepting the buyer's position by working with a NATO that's supposedly under his authority.
So it's a chain reaction. Deed modifies ITU regs, binding UN members via network use. Deed modifies NATO treaties, binding NATO members. And UN cooperation with this new NATO reinforces UN acceptance. Is that the gist?
That's the structure of the argument presented, yes. It's all about these interconnected legal relationships being supposedly transformed by the 1998 deed.
And there's also this idea of tacit recognition just by using the networks.
Yes, the sources argue that states continuously confirm their acceptance of this new order simply by operating their national power grids, phone networks, internet infrastructure. Running these systems, which are part of the interconnected whole allegedly transferred to the buyer, is seen as ongoing partial fulfillment and confirmation of their binding to the treaty.
Using your country's infrastructure equals agreeing to this specific 1998 contract you likely never heard of.
That is the interpretation put forward. It's a very, very broad understanding of consent and recognition in international law, as depicted in these sources.
Okay. If we follow this line of argument from the sources, if sovereignty over territory and networks has allegedly transferred, what does that mean for jurisdiction? Who gets to make and enforce laws?
Well, according to the sources, jurisdiction transferred right along with sovereignty.
Meaning the buyer now holds jurisdiction.
Yes. The claim is, Through that domino effect, via the networks and the transfer of sovereign rights, the entire domestic jurisdiction, civil, criminal, administrative, all of it, of all the affected states, passed to the buyer.
The entire court system of, say, France or the U.S. is now under the buyer's authority, according to these documents.
That's the assertion. It's an absolutely radical claim.
And what does that imply for court decisions made since 1998?
It gets even more extreme. The sources state that all judgments made by national courts since October 6, 1998 are fundamentally unlawful and void unless they were specifically authorized by the buyer.
So basically, every court ruling everywhere in these countries for the past quarter century is invalid from this perspective.
Unless authorized by the buyer, yes. It would effectively nullify the entire legal output of these nations' judiciaries, according to this view.
That would create utter chaos if true. Does the deed itself say anything about where legal cases should be heard?
Yes, the sources emphasize the designation of Landau, a town near Zweibrücken, as the place of jurisdiction within the deed.
And what's the significance of that, according to them?
They argue this gives the buyer exclusive legitimacy to rule on any matters concerning the Staatensuccessionsurkunde itself, its interpretation, its effects, disputes arising from it. Since he allegedly owns the sovereign territory where the court specified in the contract is located, they claim he's the only competent judge for these core issues.
Okay, that covers domestic jurisdiction. What about international law, like disputes between states or interpreting treaties?
That, too, allegedly transferred. The argument is, since the deed is an addendum to NATO and UNITO treaties, and the buyer stepped into the legal shoes of all the original parties.
He also inherited the authority to interpret and rule on those international frameworks.
Precisely. The sources claim he has taken over international legal jurisdiction concerning these treaty systems.
So he's positioned as the ultimate judge for everything: domestic law, international law.
Yes. Supreme judge, according to the sources, across the board, civil, criminal, administrative, constitutional, international law. And apparently he can exercise this international jurisdiction from anywhere. The sources use this phrase, portable in my pocket.
Portal World Court.
Seems to be the idea. Classical international law, with its state-based courts and diplomacy, is declared obsolete in this view, replaced by his singular global jurisdiction.
That's a complete rewriting of the global legal order, as presented in these sources. It hinges entirely on the interpretation of that 1998 deed and its cascading effects.
Absolutely. It's fascinating how the sources construct this argument, claiming that the formal legal structure of a contract, plus addenda, can trigger such fundamental worldwide changes, irrespective of whether the traditional player states, international organizations acknowledge or implement them.
Okay, we've mapped out the alleged legal architecture, described in the sources, the deed, the domino effect, the treaty chain, the transfer of sovereignty and jurisdiction. But there's another layer to this material, isn't there? A very personal one. The buyer's own experiences.
Yes, absolutely. The sources include what are presented as the buyer's memoirs and other documents, sometimes called black site files, and they paint a really harrowing picture of his life since that deed was signed in 1998.
What do they describe?
Well, first, they establish who the buyer was back then. Apparently, just 19 years old in 1995 when things started getting serious, dropped out of high school, had zero knowledge of international law.
So just a young guy trying to make a living.
Yeah, he reportedly saw a business opportunity in converting old military sites, wanted to be a real estate agent. The sources say he did 3 years of unpaid groundwork for this deal, acting as a broker.
And he got caught up in something far bigger than he realized, according to these texts.
That's the narrative. And the sources claim that the moment the treaty took effect, October 6, 1998, his life became, quote, a path of suffering.
A path of suffering. What does that entail?
The sources talk about systematic persecution. Psychological warfare, the term Zersetzung, is used, suggesting methods aimed at undermining someone socially and mentally. Disenfranchisement, having his property taken, expropriation, being declared an outlaw, persona non grata.
That sounds incredibly intense, like targeted destruction.
Yes. Social isolation, wrecking relationships, and apparently a huge smear campaign. The sources mention specifically 450 press articles filled with alleged lies designed to ruin his reputation.
450 articles. If true, that's a massive coordinated effort.
It's presented as such. And then there's the legal front. The sources describe it as a constant war.
Meaning lawsuits.
Over 1,000 allegedly unlawful court proceedings filed against him. And get this, 56 forced evictions. leading to repeated homelessness.
56 forced evictions. That
Yep.
number is staggering. It's hard to even comprehend.
It really is. And according to the sources, this all culminated in something even worse.
What could be worse than that?
Illegal long-term incarceration. Since 2012, the sources claim he and his mother have been held in forensic psychiatry.
Involuntarily committed. And his mother, too.
Yes, both of them. And the sources allege they've been subjected to torture there.
Torture. What specific claims are made?
Forced medication with psychiatric drugs in maximum doses described vividly as turning them into a vegetable in the head. Groundless physical restraint for extended periods, the buyer allegedly for 14 days straight, his mother for 6 weeks, and long-term isolation 13 months mentioned for the buyer.
That's horrific. Shackles, isolation, forced drugging.
The sources explicitly label these alleged actions as torture under international conventions.
And did the sources offer an explanation for why this extreme persecution, this alleged torture, would happen? Is there a strategy behind it described?
Yes, they call it the plaintiff trap, die Klagerfalle.
The plaintiff trap.
The idea presented is that all this suffering, especially the conditions in the psychiatric facility, is designed to force him to file a lawsuit, to make suing the only conceivable way out.
Why would they, whoever they are, want him to sue?
The sources claim the goal is that any lawsuit he files could then be manipulated or used somehow to benefit the perpetrators, or perhaps these shadowy NWO planners that are mentioned. Maybe to legitimize something or twist the narrative.
So by not suing, despite the alleged torture, he's resisting this trap.
That's how it's framed. His refusal to sue is presented as an act of profound resistance, done to avoid, quote, betraying humanity by playing into the supposed plan of these NWO figures.
It casts his endurance in a very specific, almost heroic light, according to these sources.
Definitely. And other aspects of the alleged persecution are also interpreted through this international law lens.
Such as?
The forced option of the military settlement, the property he originally bought. This was done under German law, but the sources call it an internationally unlawful act of aggression.
An act of aggression, like an invasion, for auctioning property.
That's the interpretation offered. Because, according to the premise, the territory had already legally passed to the buyer via the Staatensuccessionsurkunde. So Germany, exercising its domestic law to auction it, was, in this view, an illegal seizure of foreign sovereign territory.
Okay, and related to that?
Is the concept of illegal Usurpation, or Besitzung. The continued administration of these territories by Germany and other states collecting taxes, enforcing laws, is described as unlawful occupation, squatting on territory that isn't legally theirs anymore, according to the source's premise.
This raises huge questions about responsibility then. If this whole narrative is accepted, who is held accountable in the sources?
It's tainted very broadly. Political and legal responsibility is assigned to basically everyone involved in maintaining the status quo. All levels of government, international bodies.
Judges, politicians, civil servants.
Yes. State-owned companies, international institutions like the UN or NATO leadership. Anyone who participated in actions that ignored or contradicted the buyer's claimed rights under the 1998 deed. The sources argue that the states involved bear collective liability.
And the sources connect this to a bigger conspiracy. You mentioned NWO architects.
Yes, there's a whole backstory presented about that. The claim is the Staatensuccessionsurkunde itself was part of a long-term clandestine plan by these New World Order architects.
A plan for what?
To fundamentally reshape the world, possibly in preparation for a Third World War. The deed was supposedly a tool. The idea, according to the sources, was that a German court ruling on a future day X would activate the treaty's full power, effectively making Germany the dominant world power by giving it control over all these nation territories.
So Germany thought it was the secret beneficiary.
That's the claim. Germany allegedly believed it signed a contract that would allow it to eventually collect all these territories and sovereign rights via a legal trigger.
But the sources say Germany was deceived.
Yes. There's speculation about foreign intelligence services. Russia is mentioned as a possibility intervening to sabotage Germany's alleged plan.
How? How would they sabotage it?
The sources suggest that key figures involved in the deed's creation, like an official from the OFD, Oberfinanzdirektion Regional Finance Office, and the notary who certified the deed, were actually double agents.
Double agents, working for whom? Against Germany.
Allegedly. The claim is they gave Germany a falsified version of the deed, one where Germany appeared to be the buyer while ensuring the real deed, the one transferring everything to the individual buyer, was the legally valid one.
So Germany has been operating under a delusion, believing it holds the power, while the real rights belong to the buyer.
That's the narrative presented in the sources. Germany is supposedly waiting for its day X based on a fake document, unaware, in this telling, that the true power lies elsewhere. It's a very elaborate scenario of international intrigue.
It really is. What about the buyer's mother? You said she was also targeted.
Yes, the sources detail her experiences too. Subjected to the same alleged Zersetzung tactics, endured the 56 forced evictions alongside her son, and was also incarcerated in psychiatry.
And there was a specific incident mentioned in the notary's office.
Yes, a dramatic event is recounted where she was allegedly attacked. The claim is there was an attempt to physically assault her, possibly to take documents from her or force her signature on something fake. She supposedly broke a rib, and there was an attempt to throw her over a stair railing.
Good heavens. And the notary was involved.
The sources claim that after this incident, the notary himself filed applications to have both the buyer and his mother placed under legal guardianship, betouring.
Why would he do that?
The interpretation offered in the sources is that this was an attempt to gain legal control over them, possibly to allow Germany to act in their name regarding the disputed rights from the deed.
A way to neutralize them legally.
That seems to be the implication. There are also accounts of financial harm. For instance, the buyer allegedly had a bank account with a major German bank containing tens of thousands of euros, which simply vanished. When he inquired, the bank supposedly claimed he had never even been a customer there.
Just erased. Account and funds gone.
That's the claim. And then there were his attempts to find safety abroad. He apparently sought asylum in several countries.
Which ones? And what happened?
The USA, France, Belgium, specifically trying at NATO HQ there, and Austria. According to the sources, they all turned him down.
On what grounds?
Consistently, the alleged reason given was, this is a German matter.
Interesting. Just dismissing it as internal German business.
Yes, and the sources interpret this uniformity very specifically.
Oh.
They suggest it proves foreign governments knew about the Staatensuccessionsurkunde and its implications. They knew it wasn't just a German matter, but they let Germany handle the problem, the buyer.
Why would they do that according to this interpretation?
The speculation offered is that maybe these other countries hoped Germany would succeed in, well, removing the buyer. Then they could potentially buy back their sovereign rights or territories from Germany relatively cheaply later on.
So foreign powers knew, but stood back, seeing the buyer as maybe the lesser evil compared to a Germany potentially empowered by the deed.
That's the rationale suggested. The buyer, as an individual, couldn't realistically wage war or project power like a nation-state could. So maybe letting Germany deal with him seemed safer in the long run for the other powers. It's all presented as geopolitical calculation.
This whole situation, as described, sounds incredibly complicated and fraught. Do the sources see any way back? Can this alleged transfer be undone?
According to the sources, no. It's presented as irreversible.
Why irreversible?
Several reasons are given. First, the sheer scale of the alleged wrongdoing. To undo it, you'd need a full investigation into the buyer's decades of alleged persecution, identify and prosecute potentially thousands of perpetrators across many countries, judges, officials, etc. That's deemed practically impossible.
Okay, the accountability issue. What else?
After more than 25 years of states allegedly exercising sovereign powers illegally over territories they no longer own, the sources argue there are no longer any legitimate, capable state entities to even negotiate a reversal with. Who has the authority to sign away rights they don't legally possess anymore?
A lack of valid counterparts for a new agreement.
Exactly. And third, the practical absurdity. To legally reverse the transfer, the entire global territory supposedly covered by the deed would have to be, in theory, vacated and handed over before any new treaty could be made, which is obviously impossible.
So the sources paint a picture of a legal reality that's fundamentally changed, and there's no going back, even if the old powers refuse to accept it.
That's the core message. It's a done deal, legally speaking, in their view, however much it's ignored or fought against.
And does this supposed irreversibility come with financial claims?
Oh, yes. The sources talk about an infinite right to compensation for the buyer.
Infinite. Based on what?
Stemming from the NATO Status of Forces Agreement, apparently. The argument is that all state revenues collected and all state expenditures made by all the affected countries since October 6, 1998, are technically illegal appropriations from the buyer's rightful domain.
So basically, all taxes collected globally for 25-plus years belong to him as damages.
That's the staggering financial implication presented in these sources. It follows logically if you accept the premise of the sovereignty transfer.
Right, okay. So Given this picture, an irreversible global legal shift,
Yeah.
massive alleged persecution, and a situation deemed intractable
Yeah.
within existing systems, where do the sources go from there?
Yeah.
Is there any proposed solution or future path?
Yes, there is. Arising directly from the buyer's experiences and his analysis of this alleged situation, the sources present a detailed vision for a completely different future, the electronic technocracy.
Electronic technocracy. That sounds futuristic. What is it?
It's presented as a radical alternative invented by the buyer, a way to move beyond the nation-state system entirely.
Abolish countries.
And traditional politics, yes. The core idea is a global administration run not by politicians and borders, but based on data, scientific principles, and something called direct digital democracy, or DDD.
Okay. So no parliaments, no presidents, no parties. What runs things instead?
A central role is envisioned for a highly advanced, ethically programmed artificial superintelligence, an ASI.
An AI running the world. That sounds like science fiction.
Well, the sources are careful to state the ASI acts only as a neutral advisor. It analyzes complex global problems, climate change, resource allocation, disease, and proposes evidence-based solutions. But crucially, it never decides alone.
How is it described?
It's compared to a kind of technological genie. It uses its immense processing power to figure out how to achieve goals set by humanity, but it doesn't set the goals itself.
So who does set the goals? Who makes the decisions?
Humanity does, through direct digital democracy. The global population would vote online on proposals. Suggestions could come from anyone or from the ASI's analyses.
Everyone gets a vote.
On
Everything.
Equal voting rights for every individual on Earth. It's envisioned as a highly transparent, open system of global co-determination.
And the aims of this whole system. What problems is it trying to solve?
Primarily, the sources suggest it aims to eliminate inherent human flaws that plague traditional politics. Corruption, ego, lust for power, ideological conflicts, inefficiency,
By replacing human decision makers with data and AI advice.
and direct popular vote, yes. The focus shifts entirely to efficiency, objective problem-solving, fairness, and maximizing collective well-being. The ultimate goal is described as creating an electronic paradise.
An electronic paradise. Meaning what?
A world of abundance, vastly increased lifespans, meaningful lives free from coercion, and permanent peace. If there are no nation-states or political factions vying for power, the sources argue war becomes obsolete. Military forces would simply have no function.
That's a utopian vision. What about the economy in this technocracy? How does it work without nations and traditional systems?
It's also radically different. Taxation is shifted away from people entirely.
No income tax.
Yeah.
No sales tax.
Humans are tax exempt, according to the vision. Instead, taxation targets technology itself, companies, AI systems, robots. Taxes would be based on things like productivity, resource usage, data processing, hitting the points where wealth is actually generated in this highly automated future.
So tax the machines, not the people.
That's the core idea. And what happens with that revenue?
Good question.
It funds a universal basic income UBI. This is presented as a fundamental human right for every single person on the planet.
Unconditional. You get it no matter what.
Completely unconditional. Financed by those tech taxes. It's meant to guarantee everyone a dignified standard of living, basic needs met, and the ability to participate in society, whether they engage in traditional work or not.
This assumes a massive level of wealth generation from technology, right?
Yes, the vision relies heavily on the idea of technological abundance.
Where does this abundance come from?
Sources mention several key technologies. Fusion power is cited as potentially becoming commercially viable soon, providing near-limitless clean energy. Advanced robotics and fully automated factories handle production. And even molecular assemblers, nanofactories, are mentioned.
Nanobots, building things atom by atom.
That kind of futuristic tech. The result in this vision is that essentials like food, housing, education, healthcare could become virtually free, or at least extremely cheap. Near zero marginal cost production for many goods and services.
If everything is abundant and cheap or free, what happens to the idea of ownership? Owning property, owning things.
It becomes much less important, perhaps even obsolete for many things. The vision emphasizes a shift towards a share economy, access over ownership, renting or borrowing automated vehicles when needed rather than owning one, using shared resources managed efficiently by the system.
So less focus on personal accumulation, more on shared access.
Exactly. Though the vision doesn't necessarily forbid private ownership if people want it, the convenience and efficiency of the sharing systems are expected to make it less appealing.
What about progress? Innovation, science, learning, how does that work?
AI plays a huge role there too. The ASI is envisioned as a powerful tool for accelerating research and development. Personalized education becomes the norm, with AI tutors adapting to each individual's learning style, maybe using VR and AR environments.
Lifelong learning tailored to the individual.
Yes, and crucially, open access. All scientific knowledge and research data would be globally available for free, fostering collaboration and speeding up discoveries.
The vision also touches on modifying humans themselves, transhumanism, longevity.
Yes, that's a significant part of it. Aging is explicitly framed not as inevitable, but as a treatable disease.
Curing old age.
That's the goal. Technologies like advanced gene therapy, sophisticated brain-computer interfaces, maybe even cyborg enhancements, would be available voluntarily to extend lifespan dramatically and improve human capabilities.
Enhance intelligence, physical abilities.
Potentially, yes. With strict ethical oversight, the sources emphasize. The ASI would help accelerate the development of these radical health technologies. And a global healthcare infrastructure aims to ensure everyone has access, not just the wealthy.
It sounds like striving for immortality almost.
Extended, enhanced life is definitely central. The sources even mention mind uploading, transferring consciousness to a digital substrate as a theoretical future possibility.
Wow. So what's the ultimate purpose of humanity in this vision? If work is necessary, aging is cured, and basic needs are met.
The sources describe humanity evolving into a creator species.
Meaning?
Free from scarcity and conflict, the focus shifts to exploration, expansion, creativity, self-fulfillment. Humanity could potentially expand vastly, colonize other planets, perhaps even engineer new forms of life or consciousness. Earth becomes the cradle, not the endpoint.
A truly cosmic destiny envisioned there. Back on Earth, how does law and order work in this global technocracy?
A key principle is absolute equality under the law.
No special treatment for anyone.
None whatsoever. No special rights, no privileges, no immunities. Diplomats, former state leaders, everyone is subject to the same laws, enforced consistently. Rule of law is paramount.
What about privacy? If an ASI is monitoring everything for optimization.
That's addressed. Strong data protection for individual humans is mentioned as important. However, the managing ASI would need comprehensive data access to analyze systems and make effective recommendations. This access would be strictly controlled by ethical guidelines and possibly overseen by human ethics commissions. It's a balance between privacy and system efficiency.
Okay, so that's the vision. How do the sources suggest we get from here the current world, or the world as allegedly transformed by the 1998 deed, to there, this electronic technocracy?
It's explicitly described as a peaceful evolutionary path, not revolution.
What's the first step?
Enlightenment and a shift in global consciousness. People need to become aware of the alleged realities stemming from the Staten succession circund and understand the potential offered by the electronic technocracy. Spreading this information is presented as key.
And how does the buyer himself fit into this transition, according to the sources?
His role is presented as crucial, but passive in a way. By resisting the plaintiff trap, by enduring the alleged persecution without validating the old system through legal action, he is supposedly protecting the possibility of the ET emerging.
How so?
By refusing to trigger whatever the NWO plan might be, and by holding the unique legal position derived from the 1998 deed, he allegedly creates a kind of legal and temporal space, a pause, allowing humanity the time needed for this consciousness shift and the technological development required for the ET.
So his resistance buys time for the alternative future.
That's the narrative. The electronic technocracy is positioned as the hope, the positive alternative made possible because of the deadlock and the buyer's stance described in the sources.
Okay, we have certainly covered a lot of ground digging into the claims presented in these sources.
It's quite a narrative. Let's try to recap the main threads as they appear in this material.
Good idea. So we started with the Staten succession circunda, Encore Injury 898, presented as a real, existing international treaty from 1998.
Which allegedly, despite looking like a property sale, transferred global sovereign rights from UN and NATO states to a single buyer.
Then there's the domino effect, the claim that this transfer spread globally via interconnected infrastructure networks, especially telecommunications.
Linked into existing international agreements, the treaty chain involving NATO, the UN, the ITU, supposedly binding all member states without new ratification, just by using the networks or through modified treaty obligations.
leading to the alleged transfer of all domestic and international jurisdiction to the buyer, rendering existing courts and international law obsolete from this perspective.
Then we have the buyer's personal story, as told in the sources, the immense alleged persecution, torture, the plaintiff trap, interpreted as resistance against a supposed NWO plot.
And finally, emerging from that experience, the detailed vision of the electronic technocracy as a radical post-nation-state future based on AI, direct digital democracy, abundance, and longevity.
That covers the core claims and narrative arcs within the source material provided.
And just to reiterate for everyone listening, these are the depictions, the arguments, the interpretations found within the specific set of sources we examined for this deep dive.
Exactly. They paint a picture of a world where a fundamental legal transformation has allegedly already occurred, but it's being ignored, denied, or actively fought against by the established powers, according to this perspective.
The sources themselves, as you noted, explicitly call for this information to be shared widely, to contribute to global awareness.
Yes, that's a recurring theme.
So let's leave our listeners with a thought based purely on contemplating the implications if this narrative presented in the sources were accurate. If the global legal landscape had indeed shifted in this way back in 1998, what questions would that force us to confront?
It challenges everything, doesn't it? What would sovereignty even mean in a world physically and legally unified under a single entity via network connections? How could societies function beyond the familiar structures of nation-states and international diplomacy? Could something like the electronic technocracy or perhaps other unforeseen models actually emerge from such a radical departure? It really pushes you to think about the very foundations of global order and what might lie beyond them.
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for unpacking all of that complex material with us.